Good evening. I'm Barbara Miller, Director of Curatorial Affairs at Museum of the Moving Image. I'm delighted to welcome you to tonight's event, Bidding Farewell in Zhang Yimou's To Live. This program is co-presented by MoMI and the Museum at Eldridge Street and is the final program in a series of events organized by Eldridge Street and supported by the National Endowment for the Arts, focused on Yu Hua's acclaimed novel To Live. We're grateful to Eldridge Street for inviting us to participate in tonight's program. I hope you've had a chance to read the book and watch the film adaptation in preparation for tonight's program with the scholars Hsiu-Chuang and Michael Berry. Before I turn it over to my colleague Sophie Lowe from Museum at Eldridge Street, I'd like to invite you to get acquainted with the many remote programs that MoMI is offering while our building is closed, including virtual screenings, conversations with filmmakers, and workshops. You can learn about them at movingimage.us. Also, for those of you in the New York area with a car, please visit the Queens Drive-In for a safe big screen experience, which we operate along with Rooftop Films and the New York Hall of Science. And finally, please keep an eye out for an announcement of MoMI's reopening, which we hope will be very, very soon. Tonight's conversation is bound to be thought-provoking, so please make use of the Q&A feature on your screen. I'll be returning later in the evening to pose some of your questions to the participants. Thanks again so much for being here, and may I introduce my colleague, Sophie Lowe.
Hello, everyone. I'm Sophie Lowe. I'm the Director of Visitor Services and Program Management at the Museum at Eldridge Street. I want to extend a huge thanks to Barbara, Eric, Becca, Tomoko, Katie, and the rest of the MoMI team for helping to make this program tonight happen. This program series has been such a wonderful adventure as we've jumped into the world of Yu Hua's novel To Live, and it's quite bittersweet to come to the last leg of our journey this evening. Before I say anything else, I'd like to acknowledge the recent hate crimes and murders in Atlanta, Georgia of Asian American women, Delana Ashley Yan, Xiao Jiatan, Dao Yofeng, Julie Park, and Hyungjung Park. We are grieving with the Asian American communities right now who are facing a rise in racism, violence, and hate. And your pain and experience matters. We hear you and we see you. And I want to acknowledge the need for broader awareness of these crimes, where they come from, why they happen, how they are not new, and call for the support of the Asian American Pacific Islander, or AAPI community. A lot of resources and information about how to help have been posted online by major news outlets and community organizations, and I urge you to check them out. A little bit about who we are at the Museum at Eldridge Street. We are located in the restored Eldridge Street Synagogue in New York City's Lower East Side. We are a National Historic Landmark, opened in 1887, and the synagogue is actually the first great house of worship built by Eastern European Jews. In addition to public programs, our museum offers exhibitions, tours, educational programs, which often tell the story of Jewish immigrant life. We explore architecture, historic preservation, and if you come to visit us when we reopen, you will notice that we are right in the middle of Chinatown. Something very important to us is sharing the stories from diverse communities in and around our neighborhood, and one of our most popular events is our signature egg rolls, egg creams, and empanadas street festival, which is going to be held virtually this year. So please join our mailing list and stay connected. It has been such an honor to be the recipient of the NEA Big Read Grant. NEA Big Read is a program of the National Endowment for the Arts, and it is designed to broaden our understanding of our world, our communities, and ourselves through the joy of sharing a good book. The Museum at Eldridge Street is one of 78 not-for-profit organizations to receive a grant to host the NEA Big Read project between 2019 and June 2020. NEA Big Read is a program of the NEA in partnership with Arts Midwest, and we thank them for their very generous support. I, of course, also want to thank our wonderful community partners, Chatham Square Library, China Institute, and the Museum of the Moving Image. We thank them for co-presenting our other programs from the series, and I also want to thank our speakers from the other night, David Wang, Mingwei Song, for their contributions, and also for Dr. Deppman for joining us tonight. And of course, I want to especially thank Michael Berry. Michael, you have been just a treasure. You've led us through this whole project, which has been over a year in the making, actually, and we could not have done this project without you. So thank you. And finally, I want to thank our VP for Institutional Advancement at the Museum at Eldridge Street, Eva Brunet, for getting us this grant and also being so absolutely essential to this series. Now, I want to introduce our speakers. Hsiu-Chuang Deppman is professor of Chinese and cinema studies at Oberlin College, where she teaches Chinese film, literature, and language. Her research interests includes history of cinema, film adaptation, documentary, media studies, and comparative literature, and modern Chinese fiction. Author of Adapted for the Screen, The Cultural Politics of Modern Chinese Fiction and Film, and Close-Ups and Long Shots in Modern Chinese Cinemas, she is also published on narrative theory and Asian popular culture in journals and edited volumes. She is currently writing a new book on Jia Zhangke's Cinema of Reflection. Michael Berry is professor of contemporary Chinese cultural studies and director of the Center for Chinese Studies at UCLA. He is the author of numerous books on Chinese cinema and culture, including Speaking in Images, Interviews in Contemporary Chinese Filmmakers, and A History of Pain, Trauma in Modern Chinese Literature and Film. He has served as a film consultant and juror for numerous film festivals, including The Golden Horse and The Fresh Wave. And he's also the translator of several books by contemporary Chinese writers, including Wild Kids, Nanjing 1937, A Love Story, The Song of Everlasting Sorrow, Remains of Life, and Wuhan Diary. And the book whose film adaptation we are discussing this evening, To Live. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Dr. Deppman to join us by unmuting herself and turning on your video. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Barbara, at the Museum of the Moving Image, and thank you, Sophie, at the Museum of Aldridge for the sponsorship and kind introduction. Thank you, Professor Michael Berry, for inviting me to be part of this important conversation. I would also like to welcome the audience for joining us. I'm truly delighted to have this opportunity to talk to you about Zhang Yimou's film adaptation of Yu Hua's novel, To Live. When I was rewatching the film during the pandemic, one thing that really struck me was the ways that Zhang Yimou filmed people saying goodbye in the streets. What does bidding farewell mean in traumatic times? I asked myself, how does Zhang Yimou present each departure cinematically and philosophically meaningful? So I will try to answer these questions today. I begin this lecture with a brief introduction to what scholars have said about the film. Then I propose a different way of looking at the notion of hope, arguing that hope and fear are often two sides of the same coin. Finally, I suggest that these farewell scenes can be construed as cinematic dashes, because the characters move across the screen to draw a physical and narrative line that makes us pause and think about the relations between space and emotion. To Live is an epic about loss and transformation. The protagonist, Fugui, opens the film with a gambling addiction so severe that he does not know how to live. After his world collapses, he learns to pick up the pieces by transforming himself from a prodigal son into a loving father and husband. If this is impressive, it is. But as a character, Fugui's star power really comes from his ability to survive both historical and personal tragedies. He lives through, for example, the Second Sino-Japanese War, the Chinese Civil War, the Great Leap Forward, and the Cultural Revolution. Worst of all, as a parent, he has to bury his son and daughter along the way. To Live has attracted a wide range of critical attention for its depictions of human suffering, Taoist cosmology, culture, history, and politics. The film integrates tragic comic components in ways that lead scholars to disagree on whether Zhang Yimou's adaptation espouses hope or doom. The final scene in particular has evoked very different critical responses. Some consider the tragic nature of the film overshadows its more optimistic touch, while others exalt the positive message of the ending and suggest that Zhang Yimou expresses hope toward life. This positive reading has a lot to do with the number of survivors in the film. Here, as you can see, there are 4, but in the novel, there is only 1. These and other conflicting views all agree that hope is a self-affirming concept, a hypothesis that orients scholars to assess the tenor of the film dualistically as either hopeful or hopeless. As convincing as these studies are, in this lecture, I argue that hope has a darker side. It is a complex mixture of emotions, which is not only associated with desire and expectation, but also with fear and despair. My interpretation of hope blends 2 schools of thought, Taoism and absurdism. I know what you might be thinking, but hear me out here. As different as they are, these 2 philosophical traditions share one big argument. The world is indifferent to human desire. Taoist philosopher Lao Tzu suggests that life is always in flux, a synthesis of antithetical but contingent forces such as yin and yang, shadow and light, which are independent of human will, logic, and values. This Taoist belief in the callous nature of the universe coincides with Albert Camus' theory of the absurd. For Camus, life is full of an elusive feeling of absurdity. The absurd occurs, he describes, when we recognize a division between our expectations of the world and the world itself, unresponsive to those expectations. Simply put, the Taoist unfeeling universe and Camus' absurd world neither care about human emotion nor respond to human need. In these philosophies, strange occurrences are often attributed to chances. This assumption limits human ability to ensure a correlation between hope and positivity. Let's look at the concept of hope from a more contemporary perspective. Many of you might have seen the 2019 award-winning film Parasite by the Korean director Bong Joon-ho. He says, the weight of hope produces such a psychological burden that it becomes an emotional parasite, enslaving our mind to prolonged suffering. And this is similar to what Camus says about the self-tormenting nature of hope that makes people deify what crushes them and find reason to hope in what impoverishes them. That said, despite pessimism, hope is not a completely lost cause. Although there is no causality between hope and success, there is no logical link between hope and failure either. In an unfeeling world, as Lao Tzu would say, nature is neither kind nor unkind to people. And sometimes one might just get lucky. When the protagonist Fugui gambles away his fortune, his family is downgraded from landlord to poor townspeople, a classification that saves his life and livelihood. Zhang Yimou shows these mixed sentiments of hope in scenes of separation. Here you can see in this slide the different scenarios in which characters take off in the streets, footpaths, third roads, and alleys. Each departure draws attention to the circumstances of the exit, creating a parallel between the callous nature of cosmic forces with the caprice of political movements. Taken as a whole, These parting events are subtle but effective criticism of China's troubling political campaigns that turned citizens against citizens, friends against friends, and children against parents. The chaos and absurdity of a capricious political climate illustrate the messiness of human agency. Politicians agitate to create change to improve lives, and yet resist change to maintain the grip of power by punishing dissent. So, how does a director show the contradiction and uncertainty of what one nation hopes? Yes, you guessed it. Zhang Yimou combines long shots with long takes to stretch these departures vertically across the screen. Each line creates the figurative cinematic dash that nuances a pause, disruption, change, or extension in the course of action. Dashes, especially the M dashes, often appear in the middle or at the end of a sentence/verse. Emily Dickinson, for example, is famous for her versatile M dashes. As Jeffrey Number says, it indicates a pregnant pause that permits reference to be made to the act of composition as an artful invention. If we dissect his sentence a little bit and think about how we transpose the artful invention from words to images, here we can see what Zhang Yimou is trying to do. He makes his characters move toward or away from the camera, drawing lines with their physical motions that connect the on-screen story with the off-screen space. Doing this allows Zhang Yimou to show that in an absurd world, sentiment is divorced from reality. For example, if the characters say goodbye under duress, thinking that things are going downhill, sometimes the unexpected occurs and puts them back on the right track. Or if the characters believe that things are going great and will only get better when they part ways, a strange twist of fate could bring disasters. So these dashes suggest that the characters are about to enter an off-screen space, the equivalent of an unfeeling universe that does not respond to human expectations. Last week, Professor Michael Berry said, this film is still banned in China. We ask ourselves, why? What is so egregious about this movie that makes it deserve a lifetime exile? Here's what I think. Zhang Yimou uses these cinematic dashes to criticize overpromised political idealism because he's able to demonstrate that the vision of moving forward is but an illusion of advancement. So far, I have talked about three main points. I look at the concept of hope from the Taoist and absurdist perspectives and argue that being hopeful creates a psychological burden that mixes faith with fear. Then I suggested a parallel between this unfeeling universe and the Chinese politics, which are both indifferent to human pathos. I also briefly discussed Zhang Yimou's aesthetic of drawing cinematic dashes to show a continuous struggle between people and this absurd world. Yes, I see a hand over there. Please tell you more about what these cinematic dashes are. I would love to. This sounds like a question I planted in the audience. But now let's take a closer look at some of the individual scenes that will help bring all these ideas together. The protagonist, Fugui, has a name that espouses a hope for blessings, Fu, and nobility, Gui. This hope, however, is dashed when his loss of family fortune coincides with the exodus of his pregnant wife. The scene begins with his inglorious exit from the gambling den, where he spends all of his money and energy. If we look at the slide carefully, Fugui has become a shadow of his former self. His emaciated figure is juxtaposed with the life-size shadow of other pleasure seekers hobnobbing behind the embroidered screen. Fugui feels played, by his opponent, the shadow puppet owner Long Er. Long Er is clearly a social climber, and in our 21st century lingo, a media influencer. His meticulous plotting earns him a doomed mention, so not exactly good fortune there either. Fugui, on the other hand, is an heir of the feudal lineage. He embraces the vice of self-indulgence in old society. Yet, once deprived of his wealth and status, he becomes strangely liberated. This transition from depletion to liberation slowly emerges in the mise-en-scène, in which Fugui is forced to confront a devastating ambush. His wife waits for hours in the dark to tell him that his actions carry consequences. She then takes off with their daughter in a rickshaw. Zhang uses a profiled medium shot to capture the protagonist's long gaze. And this is a textbook example for shallow depth of field. It has a blurry background that highlights Fugui's compressed anxiety. The silhouettes of ghostly figures make the gambling den look almost like a haunted house, full of sexual and materialistic trappings. Meanwhile, the profile shot brings to focus a stricken individual's profound self-reckoning. His eyes trace the movement of the rickshaw traveling quite fast toward an arch framed by the light coming from the other end of the street. In this shot, Zhang Yimou shifts to deep depth of field. The 10-second scene contrasts with Fugui's shallow surroundings and invites the audience to see how the sentiment of despair morphs into literally a brighter outlook for the future. So it is important to examine the director's mixed signals here. A combination of shades and lights makes the viewer unsure whether it's late night or early morning. But this ambivalence opens up a Taoist path that blends yin/moon/night and yang/sun/day, an integration that, according to Lao Tzu, gives birth to the world. Lao Tzu explains, all things leave behind darkness, out of which they are born, and move toward embracing light, from which they emerge. Only a balance between light and darkness can the world be harmonized. As Jiazhen and Fengsha exit a dark past occupied by Fugui, Lao Tzu's theory about how to cultivate the path reinforces the interdependence of these conflicting elements and foreshadows an ultimate union among the three. This scene of separation is also politically prescient. As the Chinese Civil War between the Nationalist Party and the Communist Party is about to begin, Jiazhen escapes from a feudal past to anticipate the arrival of a new political reality. But despite the character's hope for a better future, the trajectory of an arbitrary universe is never responsive to human wishes. Shadows are always lurking behind the lights. Well, I did not mean to inundate you with all the historical information, but Zhang Yimou's representations of political events from 1949 to 1976 helps explain why this film is still banned in China. Here you can see the 100 Flowers campaign, a brief moment of free speech, anti-rightist movements, Great Leap Forward, and the Cultural Revolution. These events all turned people's lives upside down. So my second example is about the Great Leap Forward. Zhang challenges the premise of a false narrative about the correlation between change and progress. Here we see Fugui is bringing his son Youqing to school not for education, but for smelting iron to impress a new district chief. The point is that they are responding to a national call for collecting scrap metal to produce steel to help industrialize and modernize China. As a result, communities across the country have been working day and night to double their efforts. On the way to school, Fugui feels especially hopeful because his son is about to take part in an event that promises to put him on the right track for good politics. Zhang presents this mood of optimism in the mise-en-scène in which the father piggybacks Youqing on a path full of greenery and vitality. As you can see here, the world is moving collectively toward one direction. It shows a forward-looking motion that envisions a better life for everyone. Matching this optimistic outlook is Fugui's Fable. And we know this fable is important because it appears 3 times in the novel and twice in the film. It is a story about how their family is now a chick, which will grow into a goose, which will turn into a sheep, which will become an ox. What happens after the ox? Youqing asks. Good question. After the ox is communism. Fugui responds with assurance, and we will have dumplings and meat every day. His fable is teleological, showing that communism is the ultimate endpoint of a long historical struggle against feudalism and capitalism. This transformative vision aligns with the parade of characters who move closer and closer toward the camera, becoming bigger and bigger on the screen, just like the troop of animals, changing sizes right in front of the audience. Zhang uses a long take to spotlight the organic and mediated affection between father and son. Their continuous motion draws a cinematic dash to communicate the weight of this growing expectation. Yet the scene raises 2 critical issues. Although Fugui tells the story in a future tense, communism is not a prospect, but a reality. Newsflash, it has already arrived. Why does Fugui pretend not to see what is in front of him or around him? Is hope so blinding that it keeps him from recognizing the state's failed promise to turn the ox into cornucopia? As he teaches Youqing obedience, listen to your father, he says, an aphorism. He also brings his son down a political path of least resistance, leading to his demise. The young boy falls asleep behind a wall, which comes crashing down on him when the new district chief falls asleep at the wheel and drives into that wall. And here is the absurdity of life. Just when parents seem to put their children in the safest place of all, the school, the politics of exhaustion kills. At nightfall, the vivacity of life, trees, and peace has now given way to the inferno of fire, noises, and darkness. As the news of Youqing's death travels, a group of young men carrying his body on a stretcher rush from the light into the shadow. This scene revises the first 2 examples and shows the lost hope of the family, the community, and the nation for a utopian society. Unlike what we saw earlier, where Jiazhen rises toward the sunrise, here Youqing is brought into the heart of the night. The mad sprint of the messengers contrasts with the complacent stroll of the father we saw earlier and sends an urgent wake-up call to people living in the communist fable. Death interrupts the present and stops the future, turning the cinematic dash into a flat line that points to a void, signaling no pause, no consciousness. The death of Youqing leads to an intense soul-searching for Chunsheng. His rise and fall as a party cadre testifies to the volatility of politics. Serving with Fugui during the Chinese Civil War, Chunsheng starts out as a military truck driver for the People's Liberation Army and climbs the ranks to become a district chief. He is a modern revolutionary man whose love of speed matches the alacrity of his promotion. It is especially tragic that he loses control of the vehicle that once burnished his expertise and courage, but now tarnishes his record. This is a turning point in the economy of hope in the story. Since the chick/child in Fugui's fable never had the chance to grow up, to remake himself, the world goes in reverse gear. Instead of taking the car, Chunsheng now walks. Gong is the enthusiasm for going to places faster, building things quicker, and catching up to Europe and America sooner. Instead, Zhang shows a damaged individual walking away from the camera down a winding dirt path. His quickening steps convey a sense of frustration about his inability to make amends. As the long shot captures a diminishing image growing more and more distant on the horizon, an era of optimism comes to a close. Zhang's long shot in long take, again, invites the viewer to survey the relations between space and emotion. The barren landscape marks a bleak departure from the fertile imagery of greenery in the fable. This tail end slowly fades into a transition, leading to a new phase of political struggles that bring down not only the leaders, but also ordinary citizens like Fengxia. As the story moves into the 1960s, hope gives way to fear. Niall the town's chief opens the third decade under the communist rule with a warning: subversiveness knows no bounds. The world during the Chinese Cultural Revolution is locked in a dualistic bind between good and evil, new and old, leftist and rightist. But the definitions of these oppositions are in constant flux, raising questions about power and punishment. If the conclusion of the 1950s foreshadows Chunsheng's downfall, the new decade confirms it. When his wife commits suicide, Chunsheng knows his days are numbered. He pays Fugui and Jiazhen a secret late-night visit in the hope of clearing his debts. In a scene reminiscent of Jiazhen's departure from Fugui 2 decades ago, Chunsheng is also moving toward the unknown as a broken soul. Unlike Jiazhen, who had her daughter with her and was expecting a second child, Chunsheng walks down the street alone, incriminated as a public enemy. If Jiazhen was seeking a new beginning, Chunsheng hopes to dictate the terms of his end. Moving as if he has a target on his back, the district chief has lost his wife, status, and vehicle, and is now stepping into the valley of shadows. And this is the same street where the burning furnaces smelted low-quality iron, and the frantic group of young men carried Yu Qing's body to his parents. Zhang Yimou again works with the Indian symbolism of light and shadow to leave the fate of Chunsheng open to interpretation. His walk draws a line down the end of the street, creating a figurative strike-through that threatens to delete his existence. In other words, the cinematic dash connects the on-screen image with the off-screen imagination, inviting us to speculate on what happens next. Yet the conclusion of Fengxia's fate is certain. Zhang segues into another political persecution in a subsequent scene in which Fugui and Jiazhen bring red eggs to thank the town's chief for his matchmaking. As they celebrate the near arrival of their grandchild, the couple are giddy with delight. They have lived and continue to live despite tragedies. This celebration encapsulates a moment of pure joy. However, at the same time, Mrs. Niall is seen weeping quietly in the bedroom, packing for her husband's imminent exile. A Mao loyalist, Mr. Niall is newly cast as a capitalist roader who is about to be sent to a labor camp. As they say goodbye, all three of them walk through the inner courtyard to the alley, halting from time to time to compare notes about political vicissitudes. The layered entryway adds texture and complexity to the political intrigues that ensnare party cadres one after another. Even though communism has arrived, people in power are constantly looking over their shoulders to search for or invent threats from within. As a result, political struggles are staged less over ideals than over paranoia and self-interest. And here we can see why this film is still unavailable in China. It is visually meaningful that the discussion about Niu's newfound villainy happens in the courtyard. He is an insider, part of the political establishment, who becomes a sacrificial pawn in the game of power. Noticeably, the door frames tightly constrain their movement, leaving these law-abiding citizens very little room for maneuver. When Niu declares, "I have always followed Chairman Mao's path," their darkening figure are overshadowed by a distinct red sign with yellow prints. Directives of the highest order, the sign quotes from Mao Zedong, "Whichever is opposed by our enemy, we need to support. Whichever is supported by our enemy, we need to oppose." Mao made a comment in 1939 during the height of the Second Sino-Japanese War. At that time, the Nationalist Party and the Communist Party considered Japan and its Chinese collaborator, Wang Jingwei, their common enemy. But this quote is now reappropriated during the Cultural Revolution to make the definition of the enemy much more fluid. This fluidity creates a mutable list that labels all the perceived dissidents as capitalist roaders, rightists, counter-revolutionaries, or double counter-revolutionaries in the case of Zhang Yimou's own father, bad influencers, landlords, and rich farmers. This catch-all approach makes possible new lines of attack against people of different ranks as the trio come out of the courtyard. Niu and the couple part ways. Zhang uses shot reverse shot to put them in different contexts. In the maze of these Chinese alleys, one path does not seem that dissimilar to another, although the two families appear to be heading toward different directions, with Niu going to a penal colony and the Xu family welcoming an heir of the proletarian class. The irony is that death chooses its own target. Fengxia will soon die of childbirth because of the anti-intellectual climate that purges all medical authorities from the hospital. Yet, at this moment, when the sun is shining on both ends of the alley, hope for a brighter future is not yet dashed. Fugui and Jiazhen makes plans to bring Fengxia to come visit after she leaves the hospital. Niu encourages Fengxia to produce a little revolutionary successor. As the characters linger and talk in the narrow passageway, their sense of unease grows. Again, if we return to Camus, he defines hope as an act of eluding that makes us get into the habit of living before acquiring the habit of thinking. When the couple stops midway to announce a plan for a future reunion, they are getting ahead of themselves by, let's say, counting their chickens before they hatch. In a political theater of the absurd, all appointments lead to disappointments. In conclusion, Zhang Yimou's cinematic dashes surprise the viewer in a way that reminds us of the artist Paul Klee's idea of taking an active line on a walk, moving freely without goal. Perhaps this line will run into a dead end, or perhaps it will cultivate a new plane. We don't really know until we follow along. And this is the charm of Zhang Yimou's storytelling. He explores the unsettling effect of seeing people off in different directions. Each departure registers a disappearing act that tests the limits of human agency while extending narrative possibilities. Collectively, these examples destabilize the meanings of the value system to which many of us subscribe. We aspire to see an orderly world in which good triumphs over evil, hope over fear, truth over lie. But the absurd occurs when we stand face to face with the irrational. How else could we explain the deaths of Youqing and Fengxia, the two morally innocent people? Confucius, the authority on virtue and ritual, describes the morally innocent Bujiu as people who find no fault in their own actions. In a rational world, they should have nothing to worry or fear, 不忧不惧, because they are ethical. And yet, in an unfeeling universe, good behaviors are not always rewarded. So the ultimate question is, what do we do in a disorderly world? Camus proposes that we should try to live with the absurd, embrace it, and think about it. This idea is similar to what Lao Tzu says about not bending the universe to human will. We can achieve this by diminishing our desire to discover the clarity of thought to practice non-action. Let us take Fengxia's Fugui's two biggest regrets, for example. First, he forces Youqing to go to school for political correctness. And then he aggressively feeds Dr. Wang 7 steam buns, 7, let me repeat that, which indirectly caused the death of Fengxia. If Fugui did not try so hard to get ahead, would his two children still be alive? The answer is, we don't know. Because in an unfeeling universe, the mind that desires is divorced from the world that disappoints. So to return to our initial inquiry, what does bidding farewell mean in traumatic times? Zhang Yimou's film invites the audience to acknowledge the absurdity of existence. And this awareness liberates us from feeling responsible for unexpected calamities. The power of this consciousness, in other words, gives us the freedom to fear, to aspire, to think, and to live. Thank you.
Thank you, Xiu-Chuang. That was wonderful. So much to talk about here. And Xiu-Chuang and I are going to now move into the second phase of the program, which is kind of a dialogue between the two of us, and then we'll open it up to some questions. Maybe I wanted to begin with this notion of Taoism and absurdism, which you discuss. In our last event with David Wong, I mentioned the first time I encountered the film, I think I was an undergraduate, and I actually did a presentation where I tried to analyze it from the dual perspectives of existentialism and Buddhism, which in some ways I think there's a certain parallel there between also what you're doing. And I wanted to bring in the Buddhist perspective a little bit here because I've always felt the work has a very strong kind of Buddhist sentiment behind what Zhang Yimou is doing. I mean, and also in the original work. So you mentioned that evolution of the animals, right? From you have the chicken to the goose to the, you know, and there's this whole evolution that comes through 3 times in the novel, twice in the film. That it can't help but remind you of the whole notion of Lunhui, or this kind of reincarnation or rebirth, right? Which is such a central part of Buddhist thought. But even more so, you spent a lot of time on the character of Chunsheng, who in the work, he appears early on in the film, right? He's Fugui's kind of brother in arms during the war years, and then he disappears and you think he's gone. And then he only reappears, and that reappearance also is a kind of a spectral reincarnation of sorts. And I always, maybe I'm overreading this, but Chunsheng's name in Chinese literally means born in spring, which is a common name, but I always read it against the poem Ye Tao Shao Bu Jin, Chun Feng Cui You Sheng, which I guess we could translate as the prairie fires can never fully extinguish all the grass, and when the spring wind comes, life returns again. And Chun Sheng, spring life or spring rebirth, are the first and last lines of that second stanza of the poem. And the way that he appears and reappears, I always felt that there's such kind of a beautiful symmetry there with kind of Buddhist sentiments. And I thought I'd just throw that back to you. And wonder to what extent do you also think some of that is playing out in the work and how that fits with your reading?
I mean, you're totally right. I mean, I agree with you about this notion of cyclical existence, the 轮回. But for Buddhist concept, it would be something like 苦海无边,回头是岸. It's like the bitter sea has no shores, and it's better that you kind of swim back. And so we kind of look at this allegory of how the animals evolve, they become bigger and bigger and perhaps better. So you have this concept or maybe illusion of finding something better in the future that is not realized in the story, because in the novel we know that pretty much everyone perished but Fugui, and in the film, I mean, that's the saddest thing for me is, as a parent, he loses these two children, and it's kind of hard to compare, to think that losing two kids or losing 7 other people will be somehow better. Losing 2 kids than losing 7 other people will be better. I think that should be kind of put in different contexts. I think when you think about the idea of tragedy. But I agree with you. I mean, there's definitely a kind of cyclical nature to it. But when you think about Chunsheng, his outcome is not better either. I mean, he started out, he first appears in the gambling house as a kind of higher hand for Long and the people there. And then slowly, he kind of climbs the ranks to become such an important military officer, and slowly he descends. So my reading, I think the biggest takeaway for me is Zhang Yimou really tries to create a parallel between this illusion of progression with this false political promise, thinking that if we do something, revolution will improve your life. So
no, thank you.
I think that would be, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think probably even more so than the notion of the cyclical narrative, right, or the story, or the reincarnation, whatever, is just the most, Buddhism at its very core root is the notion all life is suffering. And this is certainly a story about suffering, right? David Wong in our previous dialogue described it as a kind of Chinese book of Job, right? Fugui just taking the burden of one loss after another. And in that sense, I think it is very much, you can also look at it from that perspective as well. But I'm wondering, maybe we should change direction a little. And we didn't talk much about the production details of this film.
Okay.
And I think maybe for our viewers, it's good to kind of contextualize it a little bit. And maybe I'll ask one more question, and then we can mix it up a little. But how would you situate this film in Zhang Yimou's career? I mean, Zhang Yimou has had such a mixed career in terms of making big budget martial arts films to small intimate art house films to films that have a very experimental feeling to comedies, love stories. How do you situate this along his creative chronology?
I mean, I see that Zhang Yimou really has gone through different stages in his creativity. So if we kind of think about the earlier period of the Red trilogy, so we have Red Sorghum, Red the Red Lantern, and Judou. And then you also have the 1993 or 4, this particular film, To Live. I think it speaks to a later film in 2014, Coming Home. And I remember in your interview with Zhang Yimou, he actually talked about why he felt personally attracted to the story about the Cultural Revolution, because that's what he had experienced. And he said something about, he quoted from Peggy Chow in your interview, saying that Peggy Chow said, when the 5th generation directors matured, go back and learn stories about the Chinese Cultural Revolution. So this film sort of situated, I would say, is a kind of bridge that is gonna be extended later on in his career. His 2014 film was really outstanding. And I imagine that he will probably make more films about the Chinese Cultural Revolution because there are more stories to be told. And in the mix, of course, he has his martial arts period where